Greetings. My name is Tom Murphy, Town Moderator, and I like to welcome all of you to what I'm calling the ABCs of Town Meeting. Just an overview of the Town Meeting process and what happens leading up to it. With me is George Hall, Town Council, who's represented Ipswich for the 7 years that I've been moderator and for 3 or 4 years before that.
A couple of years anyway, yeah, since
okay.
2008.
And in addition to George's career as a municipal lawyer, he took a turn as a town moderator in Topsfield a few years ago, so he's well familiar with the topic. So tonight we'll be discussing the town meeting warrant, how the warrant comes together, and the mechanics of town meeting, and a number of policy things to consider. Okay, so let me start off, George, by asking you, I've always found it's helpful to know where you're going by looking a little bit about where you came from. And so tell us about town meeting. Where does it come from, and how did it come about?
The town meeting form of government, of local government, is, with a few minor exceptions, unique to New England. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is it's very tied up in the historical development of the Congregational Church. Massachusetts started out as a theocracy, and we didn't have separation of church and state until actually well into the 18th century. And
yeah, I read somewhere actually that Massachusetts was the last state to separate church and state.
Yeah,
it was like
really into the 1840s, I think.
1830s or 40s, right.
And so originally the parish and the town were the same thing. When an area broke off and became its own town from one of the original towns like Newbury or Ipswich or Salem, it did so because it had enough tithing families to support a meeting house and a minister.
Right.
And the business meeting of the church and the town meeting were the same thing.
Right.
When I first started practicing municipal law in the 1990s, I was asked by the minister of the church, First Congregational Church in Newbury, to help revise the bylaws, and I was really struck by two things. One was how similar they were to all the town bylaws that I had read, and that's not a coincidence because they come from a common source.
Right.
And the other was that it prescribed the most exquisitely horizontal management structure that I'd ever seen. There was a committee assignment for everybody, and nobody had any authority over anybody else. And actually, that reflects that, at least within the congregation, not everybody was admitted to membership in the church. They were Calvinists, and they
right.
believed that some people were saved and the rest were not. But if you were admitted, among those who were members of the church, they were radical egalitarians. Everybody had an equal voice. The minister was merely the first among equals. And the church acted through the body as a whole. And that really is still reflected in the way that we conceive of town government and the roles that we assign to our leaders. We have selectmen, we have other board members, but when it comes to town governance, at least into the modern era, they are the first among equals, not necessarily right. People with executive authority.
In the old days, I'm imagining in the 1700s, 20, 30, 50 people meeting, probably in a church, doing everything from picking jurors to condemning property to, when it became vogue, issuing liquor licenses, things like that?
Well, yeah, I think there were not a lot of constraints on what the town meeting was thought to be allowed to do as far as matters affecting that community. Right. So whatever jurisdiction it had over the people that lived there, over the activities taking place there, they were exercised through the town meeting. Bearing in mind that towns didn't have really any employees. Right. Everything that was done by a town was done through citizens acting as volunteers, and all important decisions were made by the body, by all of the town voters acting as a body.
And you think about it, that's what we have largely today. I mean, the finance committee, the selectmen, the school committee, the moderator, there are nominal salaries, but we're all volunteers.
Right.
And the committees that they form, the school building committee, the public facility building, public safety facility committee, and these are all volunteers. So if we fast forward to, say, after the state constitution, when, if nothing else, we have now this sort of separation of government, town meeting loses some of its authority, I would think.
Well, towns lost a lot of authority. I think
Towns.
that what happened was that the independence led to a strong state government.
Right.
And state government put a lot of constraints on what towns could do. And in fact, for a long time constitutionally, towns were essentially considered creatures of the state, that the state legislature dissolved towns or appended them to other towns or created new ones without necessarily the consent of the inhabitants. And towns could not adopt bylaws except where they were specifically authorized to do that by the legislature. This has shifted back a little bit with the adoption of the Home Rule amendments in the 1960s.
Which is in the 60s, right.
So now towns can adopt legislation in the bylaws essentially, as long as they're not inconsistent with state law. But at the same time, the other big change is that state government has kind of enlisted these volunteer boards or these and given them state responsibilities.
Right.
So over the course of the years, selectmen have been assigned, licensing powers, and we've created planning boards and zoning boards and conservation commissions and boards of health that have specific responsibilities given to them by statute that kind of take them beyond the scope of what the town meeting.
Speaking of
can
selectmen, I
regulate.
read somewhere, and I wrote this down, the selectmen are the most heavily regulated local officials in the country.
Well, town government is very heavily
Yeah.
regulated, just period.
Yeah.
I think, believe me, I get calls from town officials every day because they have to navigate a pretty, challenging set
Yeah.
of constraints on what they do and how they do it.
So if we go from the old days when town meeting was required, people were fined for not going,
Right.
to today, to the modern area, it has lost some of its authority, but what's left? I mean, what is the function of town meeting?
Well, town meeting is the legislative body of the town, and that really means two major things. One is that it determines how taxpayer money is spent. No taxpayer money, no real local taxes or fees are spent without a vote of town meeting.
Okay.
And we refer to these as appropriations. Some of it can take place through revolving funds, but those also have to be authorized by town meetings. So they're either specific appropriations of a set amount of money for something or an authorization to use fee revenue for something, but those have to run through town meeting. And the other thing that the town does is enact bylaws, the local legislation.
Subject to the control of the state, the home rule.
Well,
And
yeah,
it can't go too far.
It can't be in contravention. It can't be contrary to state law or federal law. And towns have to submit their bylaws to the Attorney General for approval, and the Attorney General is looking out for those conflicts and will disapprove a bylaw if it's in conflict with state law. But beyond that, the Home Rule Amendment allows towns to a fair amount of latitude in what kind of bylaws they enact. And so those are the two major things. I mean, the third thing is they can obviously enact their own rules for the conduct of meetings, and they can establish committees to advise them. And but the two big things are money and local legislation.
Well, and on that third, for example, in Ipswich, the town meeting created the Open Space Committee 25 years ago. So it creates committees as well as they
Yeah,
go.
I mean, the idea behind these is that the committees are envisioned to come back to advise the voters
And-
about.
or come back to the town and report to
Right.
the town, this is what
Right.
we came up with, and,
Right.
okay. I envision sort of town meeting as like the Super Bowl of the town process. Tell us, how do we get to it? What happens before we get there?
Well, obviously every town meeting begins pursuant to a warrant.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that long before the warrant gets posted, because there's a regularity to these things, every town has to have an annual town meeting sometime between March 1st and the end of June, because every town is obligated by state law to adopt a budget. And in Ipswich, in addition to prescribing the date of the annual town meeting in May, the bylaws prescribe a regular fall town meeting, I guess really to take the pressure off the sort of volume of business that would otherwise come cascading down on everybody in May if we didn't plan for this additional meeting in the fall. And because we have this regular cycle, we're really always in the planning process. The budget process for the spring will start in the middle of the fall, even before the new year. Zoning articles that are going to be presented in the fall have been in the works probably since the spring and have been subject to hearings in the summer. And all of this reflects the fact that we rely on the town boards to really develop things that have been well thought through to be presented to the town to vote on. It's really, the town government has become complex enough that I think we really rely on town boards and committees to put something solid up there for people to vote on.
And some of those, like planning board, for example, some of those are required by law, by state law, to have those hearings.
Yes, the Zoning Act requires that the planning board have hearings and gives the planning board the role of planning and
the real estate advisor,
prescribing rules in a zoning bylaw. But in general, I mean, the selectmen participate in a budget process that's initiated by the town manager. The school committee has its own budget process, and other boards and committees are sort of planning all of this. So by the time the warrant comes around, there have been months of work that have already gone into it, and a lot of things have already started to be kind of baked into the warrant.
So it would seem to me that if I want to make a point on Article 6 at the town meeting, the time to really get into it is during the hearing process, well before you get to the town meeting, because that's sort of the end of the final result, where yes or no. If you want to have some significant input on whatever the issue may be, it's the hearing process that one should get involved in. Now, obviously, we all live busy lives. We can't all go to all of them, but that's the time you really want to get into it.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk a little bit about those two meetings. A town can have as many meetings as it wants, and there were times in history when towns had a lot of meetings.
Yeah.
But the price of doing everything as a body of the whole is that you spend an awful lot of time at town meeting. And so one of the things that has evolved is effectively the delegation of a lot of this planning work to town boards and committees. So if you really want to shape the things that eventually come before a town meeting, you need to become involved early on. It's a very difficult thing if you're just beginning to focus on an article the week before town meeting to have a big impact on how it's going to look. We do, as we'll get into, you do entertain amendments on town meeting floor, but in general, that's not an efficient. The idea that everybody shows up and we decide what we're going to do about this and design it on the floor at town meeting isn't practical a lot of the time.
It's part of the process, but it's when someone may well have already had that idea 3 months earlier in the hearing, and there were people at the hearing that had expertise that explained, no, this is not a good idea, and here's why. So that's the reason to get involved in it early on. And so how does, after the hearing process, it's the selectmen who are actually responsible to prepare the warrant?
Right, so the statute assigns the selectmen at least the default responsibility for calling the town meeting by issuing a warrant. And there's a draft warrant already kicking around for the fall town meeting that just reflects people's various submissions, but that goes before the board. and the board makes a decision, at least with respect to the ones that have been submitted by town departments, what they want to bring forward in the fall. Now, a warrant sounds a lot like what a judge issues for your arrest, and that's because at one point town meeting was compulsory, and the constable actually was given a warrant to go round everybody up for town meeting. Now what it has turned into is essentially a warning. You don't have to go, but this is telling you what the topics are that the town meeting will consider and vote on.
Mm-hmm.
And the selectmen, as I said, get to determine what's on or off, at least initially. However, this is where the sort of the Puritan attitude about the selectmen being first among equals comes into play. Citizens can call town meetings with 200 signatures, or at least require the board to call them within a short period of time. And citizens can get stuff on the warrant, get topics on the warrant. 100 signatures for a special town meeting, and only 10 for the annual town meeting.
In fact, I was digging through my notes here. This is from 1715. And it's a statute written in that Elizabethan legalese, sort of. But that's the source of the, quote, 10 or more of the freeholders in any town, if they shall sign it, the selectmen shall put that on the warrant.
Right. Which is just a reflection of the fact that the town meeting really belongs to the voters of the town.
Right.
Ultimately. And so even though the selectmen are sort of given the responsibility of putting the warrant together, and they choose what to put forward in terms of what town departments are contemplating. And it gives them the opportunity, often working with the finance committee, to tell some boards, let's postpone this, or this isn't ready. But if the citizens really want to bring something forward for a vote, there's mechanisms to do that.
Right. However, that reminds me of a topic we discussed off the record earlier. Some articles that make it onto the warrant are binding and some are not. So let's talk a little bit about what it is that makes something non-binding. It isn't simply by virtue of it being a citizen petition that something is non-binding. I mean, a citizen could have an entirely binding article.
Citizens can bring forward petitions to enact bylaws.
Absolutely.
To appropriate money, to do all kinds of things that are binding. Where this really comes up, and it comes up more and more these days, it goes back to this idea of the separation of powers between the town meeting and the and the boards who are carrying out their statutory duties.
Right.
It essentially, once the legislature has said to the Board of Selectmen, for example, the legislature assigns collective bargaining responsibility to the executive and not to the town meeting. And so a town meeting can't say to the selectmen, we want you to include, these kinds of health benefits in the contract with the fire department personnel. They can't tell the Board of Health what kind of health regulations they should be enacting. So often when people get frustrated with one of these boards, they want the opportunity for the public to express themselves about what they would like the board to be doing. And they're free to do that. But ultimately, if that power still resides with the board, all the town meeting can do is say, this is what we would desire or we would wish for you to do. They can't make them do it. Right. And so we do have some debates that really just reflect a sense of the town about how they would like boards to be conducting themselves. And that's, just because something isn't enforceable by a judge doesn't mean it's not important or significant. So,
absolutely. Yeah. So we have we have the town meeting, we have the article, the warrants issued, and it's posted. And when we convene, tell us about the sort of cast of characters involved.
Well, it's funny, the different towns have sort of a different arrangement of how people appear at the front of the room, and some of that's dictated by how much space you have up at the front of the room to accommodate people. And the only people that are really necessary everywhere are the moderator and the town clerk.
Right. So the moderator being the presiding officer and the clerk being
the recording
keeper of
official, yes, the
Right.
keeper of the records. And so in my experience, those two officials are always present, sitting in close proximity to each other at the front of the room. The moderator, as you've found that 1715 statute, was created to preside over the meeting and to keep good and decide all questions of order, and to regulate the proceedings, I think is another phrase that still appears in the statute. And so the moderator is an essential, has an essential role in the conduct of town meeting. And if there's a vacancy in the position of moderator, the first order of business of the town meeting, usually presided over by the town clerk, is to elect one.
Right. In fact, getting back to that 1715 statute, it said that there shall be a moderator elected. So for the next 200 years, so to the early 1900s, the first article on every warrant was to elect a moderator.
Right.
And was only 100 years ago that the legislature said, okay, towns, if you want, you can elect your moderators at the town, during the town
Right.
election, which is why in Ipswich, it's still a one-year term.
Yep.
And I think the thinking is, you know, if he's a rat or a bum, you throw him out the next year and you get a new one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a one-year term in Topsfield also, and that meant I had to go get signatures every year.
I omitted that from your introduction. I apologize. In addition to being a career municipal lawyer, George has also done a run at town as a moderator in Topsfield.
So I think that probably the next most important sort of institutionally a set of officials is a finance committee.
Right.
Every town is actually required by statute to have a finance committee. It can be called something else. Some towns call it the advisory board or the warrant committee.
The warrant committee. Yeah.
But it functions, its main purpose is to advise the voters on the matters that are being presented to it, especially on matters relating to the budget and to appropriations. And in that sense, it's like the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives.
Right.
Both federal and state have them. They're powerful committees. They're charged with investigating all proposals for the expenditure of money and coming back to the voters and telling them whether they think it's a good expenditure or not. And it's really meant to help the voters make informed and wise decisions about spending.
And just a footnote, in Ipswich, although it's called the Finance Committee, it could well be called the Advisory or Warrant Committee. They don't just advise on financial matters.
Yep. And that's something that's a little different in different towns around the state. In one of the towns I represent, the Finance Committee really does kind of restrict itself to
Just financial matters.
Now, by the same token, the Finance Committee in Topsfield actually made all of the initial motions, both on financial and non-financial matters. So
they would make the main motions
Yep.
at the town meeting
Yep.
for all, under every article.
every action was initially based on the recommendation of the Finance Committee. So naturally, they would be in the front of the room because they were essentially
Right.
launching every discussion with their motion. The other key figures, obviously, in Ipswich that appear on the stage are the school committee and the planning board and the board of selectmen, all of whom play really important roles in the development of the budgets and the other actions that are being proposed. They're often the proponents of these actions. So obviously, people are interested in their recommendations on all these topics, and they often have a lot to say about it. So. Those are also important players.
Your original point about the architecture of the room sort of defines things, and I'll confess that the reason I have some of those boards on the stage with the Finance Committee and the clerk and me is because we have this orchestra pit there.
Right.
And you can't put them there, but
Right.
ideally all others would be there because that is symbolic that everyone's equal.
Right.
And while the selectmen and the school committee are executives, they're just members of the meeting.
Right.
for that day. 364 or every other day of the year, they're running the town. But in there, while they may be the most well-informed members of the meeting, they're meeting members only.
Right, and they, by tradition, they may get the first word on the topic, but they
Yeah.
may not get the last one.
Right.
So that gets determined by other
Yes.
other
it does.
things.
So that gets us into the mechanics of the meeting. So we've got the moderator takes the articles. We have a bylaw that says that moderators are supposed to take them sequentially,
Yep.
unless there's a vote otherwise, and that can be, and that has happened. You may recall that happened at our spring
Yep.
meeting this year.
Yep.
There was a citizen's petition about a school somewhere, as I recall. And so after I take the articles, the proponent's given 5 minutes to make a presentation, and then I look first to the Finance Committee for their recommendation, and then to the other boards, and then open up for debate.
You should probably point out, too, that that motion, what's
main-
being proposed,
The main motion.
may or may not be exactly what's written in the warrant.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's talk a little bit about the difference
Yep.
between an article and the main motion, or
Yep.
a motion. An article is general, a motion is specific.
Yeah, and we try as best we can to draft the articles so that they can be moved as printed,
Right.
because we find that people
And
are...
on that, so moved as printed, meaning the motion can be, I move the article as printed in the warrant.
Right.
And then the article becomes the motion.
Right. And the reason for that is that people, if they're confronted with something that looks a lot different from what they read on the warrant that came to their home,
Yeah.
feel like they really, in many cases, don't have the time or the ability to consult with other people to know the significance of the differences, and we try to be respectful of that. But the reality is the warrant is a warning. It's really just telling you what the subject matter of the vote is. So if the proposal is to enact a stormwater bylaw, that's the proposal. The proposal isn't necessarily to enact it exactly as it's printed. And once that thing gets launched onto the floor, it can be tweaked. It can also be tweaked as part of the main motion. If something
Right.
can be proposed that differs in some ways from what was printed in the warrant.
So the motion could be, I move Article 6 as stated in the warrant, except for subparagraph 2.
Right. And in the past, we've even had handouts that show
Right.
something that's different from what's printed in the warrant. Again, that annoys people because they've now got two different documents and they're trying to understand what's different. And we
Right.
try to avoid doing that. But again, there's nothing historically unusual about somebody putting something forward as a motion that's different in some real respects from what was printed in the warrant.
Right. So that brings us to what we've come to call the four corners.
Right.
Okay. Moderators, or many people refer to it as the scope of the article issue, but we talked about this earlier, that the term scope is a little wishy-washy because it can be unclear. But people refer to the term four corners. Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Well, again, the article, the warrant gives a warning.
Mhm.
And the question is, are there some limits on how far outside that you can go? And there are. And it really comes down to, I tend to think of it as just sort of fair warning to the people who aren't here. If I am sitting at home and the warrant comes to me, or I'm reviewing it wherever it's posted, and I see an article that proposes to change the zoning of the downtown business district, I shouldn't have to anticipate that they might change the zoning in the residential district
Right.
where I live and affect my property. I haven't been warned of that.
The scope or the four corners check that I've always relied on, or come to rely on, is that person sitting at home who didn't go to the meeting and read it, and if he got up the next morning and said, wait, they did that?
Exactly.
That is beyond the scope.
Now,
That's beyond the four
this is
corners.
sort of it's a little tautological because, of course, what's fair to expect depends on what the rules are, right?
Right.
So
Right.
you also have to understand that the warrant isn't it's not meant to be an accurate forecast exactly of what will happen. So if the warrant says, for example, I mean, a budget can be adjusted, and certain line items can be increased and others can be decreased, an appropriation can be decreased, the language in a bylaw can be changed, as long as the overall sort of purpose of what was proposed is more or less the same.
The subject matter.
So if you're interested in the subject matter, you need to go.
Right.
You can't sort of take any solace that as long as they don't change the wording of Section 3, I'll be okay. I mean, if this is just to take my previous example, a stormwater bylaw, you've got to assume the whole subject of stormwater regulation is in play.
Right.
And these rules affect both the proponent of the article, but also people who want to amend the article.
Right.
And you have to decide as the moderator whether these are consistent with the idea of fair warning.
Whether it's within the same subject
Right,
matter.
whether it's within the four corners, or whether it's within the scope, is the subject matter, does the different proposals still reflect the same subject matter that's described in the warrant article?
I'll give you an example. You remember in January this year, the town bought that Pony Express property.
Yep.
And there was a motion to amend it to require that go to a town, if it
Right.
passed, go to a townwide vote. Now, I didn't think that was within the scope. I didn't think that was the subject matter, but I used my discretion to let it go because I just had a feeling. There were a number of other factors. I don't remember all of them right now, but there are other factors involved that I thought that was the wise thing to do.
I had some reservations about that, but they weren't scope reservations, because my feeling is if the proposal is to spend money and somebody says, or just simply wants to impose a condition to say you can spend the money but only if you do something else first, that's still, it still pertains to the subject of shall we spend the money. And you can think of a lot of other contingencies. I mean, if somebody had proposed we should spend the money but only if we get a title report, or only if we can get title insurance, or only if we get a clean hazardous materials inspection report or something like that, that these aren't things that are mentioned in the article, but they go directly to the question, should we be spending the money?
Yeah,
And if so, under what circumstances? So I don't view that as a scope issue, but to some degree there's there's necessarily an element of politics in this decision, and it's why people want to turn to me as town council to, in some cases they want me to overrule you.
Because I think it's a legal
But if it's
question.
a close question, you're the one who's elected. You're balancing the interests of those who may have chosen to stay home
Right.
with the people who have come and who want to make a decision that may be a little bit different from what was forecast in the warrant. And I don't know that there's always bright line rules that can be applied. And sometimes you just have to use your judgment about what's fair.
It wasn't solely a scope issue, but I just remember making the decision that night. Remember we talked about it at the beginning of the meeting, and I was thinking about it throughout, and the debate, and it's just sort of a decision you make on the fly, that's why it's a one-year term.
Right.
Another scope example that comes to mind is a few years back, and it ruffled a few feathers. There was a OPEB, this other post-employment benefits, this savings fund where we tuck away money for a rainy day when more town employees retire and we have to pay for their benefits. There was a motion from the Finance Committee to raise it from $100,000 to $200,000. Now, that's just changing the number. That's not changing the subject matter. And so I let it go. I mean, I said, yeah, that's fine. And some people were upset, but
Well, there's a school of thought in some towns that if there's a dollar number put in an article, then
That's
you
fixed.
can never go above
Yeah.
that.
I've read that, but that's a
And
minority.
It's a minority rule, and this was a situation in which the town was wasn't really spending the money. The town was moving it from the general fund to a reserve fund.
It's putting it from one bucket to another.
It's an argument that's been had over and over again about whether the town is putting sufficient money away to against these future liabilities. So I mean, I think it was fair to suspect most experienced town meeting voters would know that we argue about the issue of the sufficiency of the appropriation all the time.
So how about if instead of raising for 100 to 200, raising for 100 to $1 million? That would be different.
Again, it's a judgment call, and then also the wording of the article comes into play, and to some degree the selectmen have a little bit of control here. I think if they put in a warrant article that says $100,000 and not one penny more, then
That's different,
or a sum not to exceed.
Right.
We use different language, and sometimes we put in when we're going to make a purchase, and the number is, we think it's a good number, but it might not be exactly right. We put in $100,000 or a greater or lesser sum. We're deliberately trying to leave ourselves the latitude. If we open a bid 2 days before the meeting and it's 102, to come in and appropriate a larger money to meet that appropriation.
So let's talk a little bit. There are some sort of fancy terms that they use, and if I can, town meeting time is the manual that our bylaw tells the moderator to follow when regulating the procedure. There's some sort of arcane terms they use in there, like indefinite postponement. I mean, what does that mean?
It really just means to vote no, to kill the article. It's kind of linked to another concept that people have a little bit of difficulty understanding, which is that every meeting is its own entity, and it doesn't really carry forward to the next one. You can't postpone discussion of something to a future town meeting, because that town meeting has its own warrant. Right. So to postpone it indefinitely basically means
let it die in the vine.
To postpone it to sometime after this town meeting, when it may or may not come back, and the effect of it is to kill it, is a no vote.
Moving the question, that's one of the few. I think moving the question, tabling something, and there's a third one that requires a 2/3 vote instead of just a simple majority. And the common denominator between the three, and I'll tell you the third and the second, is that they all have to do with somehow limiting debate.
Right.
So, lay something on the table, and move the previous question, and to limit or extend the debate. Moving the question, that's stop the vote.
I got in the habit when I was a moderator, whenever somebody said I moved the question, to say, Mr. Smith has moved to shut off the debate. Because that's really all it is.
That's all it is.
And it's similar to a cloture vote in the U.S. Senate to end debate and proceed to a vote. We're going to stop talking now, we're going to have a vote. The reference to the previous question is important, because sometimes you may have a motion and then an amendment, and maybe even an amendment to amendment on the floor. And so the only thing you can go to is the immediately previous question, which might be the amendment to the amendment. But the effect of it is simply enough, let's vote.
Right.
And of course, to allow debate on that would sort of defeat the whole purpose of allowing people to decide that they're done.
But after a couple of years of in this line of business, someone moved the question, and I said, no, well, let's hold off a second. It was, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes into the debate. And all the selectmen looked at me like, hey, he moved the question. What's the story?
Right.
So was I out of line on that?
I think you have the prerogative not to accept the motion. I do think there are lots of situations where somebody just is trying to rush the meeting into a
Right.
decision.
I only bring that up to show that, to point out that it's not, I don't have to recognize it, but on the other hand, I shouldn't do it myself.
Well, the other thing related to this that we have, and I don't remember whether we got it into the bylaws or this is something that you've just enforced, is the no last word rule.
Oh, the Lucy Van Pelt
which
rule, yes, we
doesn't
did.
allow you to get up, make a speech, and then move the question,
Right.
so that to insist that you get the last word. And that actually is a common rule in a number of the meetings that I attend, because it strikes everybody as unfair for someone to try to claim the last word on the topic.
In addition to amendments to the main motions under the article, there are other motions that people make from time to time. And one, actually, a moderator can do his or herself if you want, and that's dividing a question. Tell us about that. How does that work? If you say you've got an article, someone moved the main article, the main motion was to move the article that has 4 parts. But they're all kind of complex. Dividing the questions, sort of taking them apart when voting one by one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some issues where, for whatever reason, the sponsor of the article has decided to take maybe 2 kind of different things and combine them into one vote. So if there's a motion to spend $500,000 to buy a new fire engine, and then also to equip it with some add-on that may or may not be essential to its purpose, and it appears from the discussion that people really want to be able to vote on these 2 things separately, so that maybe they can say yes to the fire engine but no to the add-on, that you can simply say, I'm going to divide this question and we're going to vote it in those 2 parts. Or somebody can move to divide it into those 2 parts. And there are a lot of situations where, for whatever reason, I mean, there are times where we put a number of things together because they're so integrally related that they either all have to be done or none of them, or the whole thing falls apart.
Right.
But that's not true of every proposal that involves 2 or more elements.
One that comes to mind is one of the articles on the November warrant is a zoning article, and those can get a little gnarly.
Yep.
And one is to amend a footnote to some density bylaw, or zoning bylaw. And another part, and it's not as much of politics, but just a matter of clarity. And it seems to me maybe breaking those into 2 might be easier. I haven't thought it all the way through yet, but.
Well, I mean, this is, we go the opposite way with the consent calendar.
Right.
Everybody would love to be able to just bundle together all the stuff that we just want to approve without having to debate it.
And what is a consent calendar?
So the consent calendar is simply, it's based on the idea that rather than voting things one by one, we're going to take a bunch of non-controversial items and we're going to bundle them together and just have one single up or down vote on it. And the reason we call it the consent, I don't know why we use the word calendar, frankly, but the word consent is related to unanimous consent, because in essence, you're suspending the rule that we vote on things singly. So, and because the idea is if any person raises their hand and says, I want to vote on that item singly, it gets pulled out of the consent calendar because you don't have unanimous consent. But these are things that we try to do to gain some efficiency in the way the town meeting is run. People only have so many hours in the evening. There may be 1 or 2 things on the warrant they want to spend their time talking about. They don't want to waste a lot of that time just sort of marching through a bunch of little things that everybody agrees on.
In Ipswich, historically, the selectmen have started the annual town meeting with a consent calendar.
Right.
My practice has been to do just that, read them through, just summarize, like this account $5,000, elderly $10,000, and hesitate between each to see if someone wants to call it out. And then, if not, just vote on them all at once.
But sometimes we also get too enthusiastic about that.
Yeah.
And there's an omnibus zoning
Right,
amendment
right.
article that has 9 unrelated amendments in it, and it turns out one of those is controversial.
Right.
And that's the circumstance we were talking about earlier about simply dividing the question.
Right.
If it really is unrelated to those things, and there's a sense that it should be debated and voted on separately, you can just make that determination, or someone can move to do that.
Oh, there's one other thing before I get to the end. There's another concept called reconsideration, and this book has some pretty confusing descriptions on. There's no one set fast rule to do it, but a few ways to handle it. So Ipswich, maybe 5 years ago, passed a bylaw that pretty tightly regulates it. Can you sort of walk through that for us, how that works?
Yeah, the traditional rule was that you could move to reconsider an article, but you could only do it once.
Right.
And
you had to have voted against it?
well, you had to
You
have
hadn't
voted
voted.
in whatever
No, you had to
whatever
vote for
side.
it.
You had to had voted with the prevailing side.
Right, you had to vote for it, right.
So if it was defeated, you had to have voted no, and
Right,
vice versa.
right.
But this book suggests that is so difficult to police that you
Yeah.
probably are better off not trying. But more to the point, I think one of the problems that emerge, one of the incentives that creates is that if you have one of those articles that's drawn a lot of people to town meeting, a school budget article or something like that, that as soon as it passes, the proponents will move to reconsider it immediately, so they can defeat reconsideration, so they can go home.
Right.
And that really just creates another. You don't want to give that incentive, but at the same time, you don't want to force people to stay to the bitter end necessarily to protect a decision that was made earlier. So Ipswich, like a number of the other towns we work with, have limited reconsideration to circumstances where there's a particular reason for it, other than somebody's counted the voters in the room and decided that maybe if we vote this again, the thing will come out differently.
So the way I read it, it's subject to the moderator's discretion, 2.5 exceeding 2.5 spending aside. There's a carve out specifically for that. It's either whether there was an error in the process, or it's in the best interest of the town, and that's something that if it came up, best interest of the town, for example, to have to sort of confer with other officials. Do you think it's something to reconsider?
Yeah, and
or
it
not?
comes up rarely, but
Yeah.
we've had situations where the day after the town meeting, the finance director or somebody says, we really shouldn't have done that because that's going
We
to
can't
create
pay
this
for it.
huge problem,
Yeah.
and that nobody thought of. And so this is just simply one of those situations where we're not reconsidering it to just decide the same issue again on the same information.
Right.
There's a reason that needs to be brought to people's attention that may actually change
Yeah.
their mind about the topic, and which really implicates the town's interests in a way that maybe people weren't aware of. So,
And that's the third thing, if there's new evidence. So
Right.
if there's new evidence, there's an error in the process, or it's in the best interest of the town.
right.
So, okay, well, this has been informative. And lastly, where can folks that are interested in finding out more get some more information about this? I know that the Ipswich Public Library has a CD by the Massachusetts Moderators Association called Town Meeting and You. Town meeting time is in the public library, and the Secretary of State has a website that has some general information. Just keep in mind that that is generic. It doesn't apply to every town because towns have bylaws, and as we discussed, town meeting is a function not only of the bylaws but also traditions.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, those are good sources. As you mentioned, the town bylaws reference town meeting time. It's actually a very accessible book, a very readable book.
yeah,
has a table in the inner leaf about which motions take priority over which
Right.
other motions and the quantum of vote required for all of them. And so it's obviously not something you sit down and read and absorb, but for anybody who aspires to sort of over time learn a few of the rules a little bit in more detail, it's great. That's a great book to have.
And if you're interested in process, it is an interesting book to read. It's not that complicated. I think there's a passage in there where it says that if you can follow the rules of professional football, and not all the nuances, but just the
Right.
general rules, you can figure out town
Right.
meeting. And so I encourage folks to read that. It's good to have people in the meeting that know how it works. But I think we can just close with one takeaway. It's just a reminder that town meeting really is the culmination of all these things after the hearing process. And folks that are really interested in something, I encourage you to go to the hearings, the planning board hearings, the finance committee hearings, the selectmen's hearings, and get involved in it. Well, thanks, George. I
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Good to talk to you.
See you on the stage.
All right.